Last week we talked about that portion of scripture that comes right before the flood. Does anybody guess what we're going to talk about today? We talked about the part where we see the birth of Noah, the one whose name means rest and comfort, followed by the realization that humanity had been corrupted so thoroughly that every thought they had was inclined toward evil. And the verse that followed that revelation was the one that tells us that our God was grieved by the turn of events. The verses don't speak of God's wrath like we think of sometimes. They speak of God's grief and God's sorrow. And this understanding of our God, one who's hurt and one who grieves, gives us insights into this story of the flood that we often overlook, but they're essential for our understanding for the rest of the Bible. God chooses to be vulnerable and feel the pain that's caused by humanity's choices. And even with this, God still chooses to work through humanity to redeem the creation that they corrupted. And even though it hurts him, like a parent who disciplines well, we'll see in this story that God will allow humanity to experience the natural consequences for their actions. When we choose evil, when we say no to God enough times, God will take a step back, even though it grieves him to do so. In the beginning, at the very creation of the universe, we see that our God is a God of order. He brings structure and beauty to the chaos that is the natural state of the cosmos. So when God is faced with a level of wickedness and injustice that encompasses almost all of humanity through the flood, we see that God makes the decision to allow humanity the freedom from God's order that it had longed for. And God allowed through the flood what ultimately is the resulting undoing of creation. The waters will rush back in. Chaos will return. And humanity will be free to live and die in the turmoil that it's chosen. Except for one. For Noah. By God's grace, God recognizes that there is a man who was righteous, whose heart did not continually turn to evil. This doesn't mean that Noah was perfect. And it doesn't mean that Noah was without sin. And scholars have used up countless pages in trying to work out exactly what it means when we say that Noah was righteous. But I think that when we look at what transpires next, the meaning of those words are evident. Even though he was surrounded by wickedness, Noah was still listening to God. Instead of Noah's heart being inclined toward evil, his heart was still attuned to God. We hear God speak through Noah's story. We read that Noah and God engaged in conversation. So we can tell that Noah was a man who looked beyond himself and his own needs. And because of this, Noah's life was different. And as we continue in this series, we're starting to see a number of themes develop and a number of truths revealed. Here's a new one that we can add to the list. When we come to the end of ourselves, when we decide that looking only to our own interests is the dead end that we always suspected that it would be, and when we turn to God, we've suddenly become the humans that We've become the humans that God can work with to accomplish the goal of redeeming what's been lost. When we turn to God, the meaning of the struggle is within our grasp, and the desperate moments that felt impossible and pointless are replaced by eternal hope and the reality that our very lives are part of the solution. You see, God doesn't work in spite of us. God is determined to use us as instruments in the redemption of creation. God chooses to work with us. So with this in mind, I want to turn to Genesis 6:14-22 after God has decided that he would allow the chaos that humanity wanted to sweep back in, unraveling creation. Here, though, we see what we always see. God makes a way for those who will look beyond themselves and to the one who holds the chaos at bay. And so God tells Noah, make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and put the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, I lost my spot now. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I'm going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life, and everything that's on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every kind shall come into you to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Now, these instructions to Noah take place right after Noah is told by God that he'll destroy the earth. And I want us to take a note of something here. We don't have great instructions. That's not a lot. That's not a blueprint, right? And I think that it's mostly because the physical ark isn't the point of the story. The ark points us to other truths. It's tempting in these stories that take place in this prehistory section in chapters 1 through 11 in Genesis to get lost in the weeds trying to create rational explanations for things that we just don't have enough information for. We see this happening when the church starts arguing about the details of these early accounts. Was the flood that we read about worldwide, or was it a regional event? What was the exact shape of the ark? What's a cubit anyway? By the way, a cubit is about 18 inches. It's like from the tip of your finger to your elbow. I mean, that's what they think. Some people say like 21 inches. I don't know. I suppose it depends on how long it is from your finger to your elbow. But people in the church will go to great lengths to win their argument for how they understand this story. And I wanted to remind you again that that's the point where the people who are supposed to be we're supposed to be sharing the gospel with, that's the point where they stop listening. When we start arguing, they stop listening. The truth is that they're worried about how it is that a God that we proclaim to be good could cause something like this to happen. But often we get too busy arguing about the details amongst ourselves to be able to address the deeper concern, and we're losing people because of it. We can't be so focused on winning an argument that holds no real value that we forget to open up the Word and demonstrate that this flood was one that came out of heartbreak. We have to point out that the God who allowed this to happen is a God who grieved. The truth isn't in the answer to what's a cubit. It's in the question of how does this story point us to Jesus? How does this story help us understand God? The fact is, as readers, no matter what you think about the details, what we're to take away is that this event is one of cosmic importance. And it's a story that if we allow it to, and we don't get it trapped by our need for a complete understanding of the details that we're not given, This event is one that demonstrates that this is not a story of destruction at the hands of an angry God. It's a story of salvation from a flood that was so complete and devastating that there are at least five different flood stories from different cultures that speak of the same event. If you've ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you'll see some shocking similarities in there. But the missing details of the account in Genesis are not missing so we'll spend our lives trying to fill in the factual gaps. They're missing so that we don't get distracted by details that don't point us to the meaning that lies within the lines of poetry that we've been given. Here's the thing. We've recognized in Eden a place of sanctuary where God sets aside an area where God's saving presence resides, right? Now, with that in mind, we'll see the ark as a place of salvation. In the near future, we'll see the Ark of the Covenant, where God's presence will dwell. And then we'll see the temple with the Holy of Holies, again in the same basic shape with the presence that God inhabits. In one of the Mesopotamian stories, they describe the shape of the ark similar to that of a ziggurat. You know what that is? It's one of their temples. And the word ark is actually a borrowed word. Sometimes in language, when we don't have a word to describe what we're talking about, we borrow words from other languages. Ark is one of those. There are Egyptian roots here. And in Egypt, an ark can be one of those barges that would float down the river, sometimes for funerals or different reasons. But these barges, get this, would carry images of the Pharaoh or their other gods. A barge that carries the image of God. You know what's the image of God? We are. We're made in God's image. A barge that carries the image of God through the chaos of the seas into safety. Does that sound familiar? The reason I'm giving you these details is because when ancient people read this story, there would have been an understanding of similarities between an ark and a temple. Even those outside the Israelite nation would have recognized that this salvation was divine in nature and that the main point was not one of destruction, but one of salvation. So back to the story. Noah does as he's asked by God to do. And we'll pick up in chapter 7 after the ark is completed. And here I'm not going to read the entire account, but God tells Noah to get into the ark with his family, and he gives instructions about the number and kinds of animals that he should bring with him on the ark. Then the flood comes, and we read in Genesis 7:17-24, the flood continued 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters swelled and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. The waters swelled so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters swelled above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, domestic animals, wild animals, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all human beings, everything on dry land, in whose nostrils the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, human beings and animals, and creeping things and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark. And the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days. Chapter 8 then begins with the words, "But God remembered Noah." This is the pivotal moment in the story. God remembers Noah. And this isn't remember like God had forgotten. It's remember more like he turns his mind toward Noah. This is remember with a response in mind. Genesis 8:1 reads, "But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the domestic animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided." Whereas the flood was a return to chaos, Where the order of creation was undone, now we'll see direct parallels to the original creation account. God is rebuilding. Out of chaos, God is stepping in again for the benefit of one person who, by God's grace, found favor. In the ancient world, the sea, the waters, represented the unknown. So when God gives people what they want, and God releases the waters that he had been holding back, chaos and the unknown flood come back into the cosmos. In essence, what we saw was an unraveling of creation. But when God remembers Noah, we see the wind blowing once more. God pushing those waters, the chaos back, holding it captive to the dry land where humanity and life can once again flourish. And this should remind us immediately of what we read a few weeks ago in Genesis 1, verse 2. The earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. So we see this act of creation repeated. At once the breath of God blows again here in Noah's account. And in Genesis 8, 2-5, we read, "The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters gradually receded from the earth. At the end of 150 days, waters had abated, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains appeared." The rest of the language here is beautiful. And if you get a moment this week, I'd encourage you to read through these chapters in one sitting and just to appreciate it. But here God moves, and what has been without the benefit of God's steadying breath that holds the chaos at bay is slowly brought back to life by God's order. Eventually, Noah and his family will exit the ark. And this is the part that I want to read to you in its entirety. But we'll start with Genesis 8, 20-22. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." So I've mentioned before that this account of Noah is a first for us in a lot of ways. Noah's our first archetype of Jesus. We see Noah, one man, standing in and making a way for many. And we recognize themes that will be evident in the rest of the Bible and would be crucial for our understanding of the fact that Jesus, one man, makes a way for us. But in this account, Noah is also our first priest, and he builds our first altar, and he is the first one to offer what we call a burnt offering. Now, we've seen offerings before, offerings out of abundance and out of gratitude, like the offerings that Cain and Abel made to the Lord. But this one's very different, and it points us to a completely different understanding of the role of sacrifice. First, these verses tell us that Noah built an altar to the Lord. There are many names for God in the Bible. In the beginning, we read the name for God, Elohim. But here we see that he built an altar to the Lord, to Yahweh. That's the God who's personal. The name where the symbols can stand for the sounds it makes when we breathe. The Yah, the breath in, and the Way, the breath out. The God whose name is spoken every time one of the creatures on this planet takes a breath. Noah builds an ark to Yahweh. The God who's present when a baby takes their first breath in. And the name that's completed when we breathe out for the last time. Noah builds an altar to the God who longs to be with us. the familiar God of relationship. And the sacrifice he makes, we often translate as burnt offering, but a better translation here of the Hebrew words might be a going up offering. It's an offering that's different from the kinds of offerings that had been previously made. When Cain and Abel made their offerings, it was a portion of what God had given them. And once we see the sacrificial system develop, these kinds of offerings are performed in a very specific way. With these kinds of offerings and sacrifices, the head and the entrails of the animal being offered were put on the altar to burn along with the fat. Then some of the meat was given to the Levites and the priests as their portion, but the rest of the meat went back to the person who was making the offering. Then they would take it back to their families and celebrate and eat the meat. But this kind of offering that Noah made was different. Noah's offering, the going up offering, is a complete offering. It's one of sacrifice. And this is so important. Noah and his family were sacrificing the clean animals, the ones that they could have eaten. And by this time, things hadn't been repopulated, so there weren't that many of them. But they took this animal of infinite value and placed the entire animal on the altar. The going up offering, the burnt offering, is the offering where the person presenting it keeps nothing for themselves. So we see Noah acting as a priest, deciding what is clean and unclean, and with no instruction, somehow knowing how to worship God in this way. And I want to go back to God's words now and read the part that bookends the beginning of this story. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Do you remember the last time we heard from the Lord's heart? Last week, when I told you to file that little tidbit away for later, that was because this is the place where we read again of the Lord's heart. The last time we saw God speaking to his heart, God's heart was grieved. This time, the Lord smells the pleasing odor of the selflessness of the sacrifice that Noah offered, and it's in his heart that he promises never to again curse the ground because of humankind. And if you notice, it's not because Noah was inherently better than anyone else. The next phrase that God utters is a recognition that still, after all of this, the human heart is evil from youth. God recognizes that humanity hasn't changed. But something else happens here. With these words, God makes it clear that he's committed to work with the remnant of humanity who will call on God, who will have faith to sacrifice even when things look bleak, and who will accept the salvation offered even when it doesn't seem to add up. For Noah, that salvation was the ark. For us, a little further along in the story, what is that salvation? It's the cross. And now in Genesis 9, 1 through 17, we see God put everything back in order with his blessing once again. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth and every bird of the air and everything that creeps on the ground. And on all the fish of the sea, into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Here, humankind is once again given dominion over creation. Even though we've proven to be untrustworthy, even though we've proven that we cannot rule justly, when Noah made that sacrifice, it demonstrated that we will also turn to God. that we are also able to trust and recognize God's gifts and to sacrifice what we want because we know that God's vision for our lives and for the resolution of this all is the only vision that's not a dead end. And even though we're imperfect, it's through sacrifice that God will redeem all that's been lost. With these words in these few chapters, God is giving us the map. God will use us to right the wrongs when we demonstrate our willingness to put God's plans before our own. If you're looking for a purpose in life, if you haven't found that key, and because of this you deal with depression and anxiety and a disconnectedness that you just can't explain, maybe God's telling you this morning to look up. We are made in God's image. And so we sometimes think that we can look to ourselves or to others to find the answers that we're searching for. But we have to go to the source. We have to look to God, to the one who made us in his image for a reason. And that reason is to be a reflection of his goodness to the world, a symbol of his love. Our creation is intrinsically linked to our purpose, which means that we find hope when we find God. You see, when Adam and Eve decided that they wanted to define good and evil for themselves, when they took that step out from under God's order, and when they faced the consequences of having to live without the God whose rule they had rejected, God told the serpent that Eve's descendants would ultimately crush the head of the serpent. All along, God planned to use humanity to redeem what had been lost. We know this. And if you're starting to put it together, this book that we live by, this is the story that'll tell us how it'll happen. It's not just our rule book. But with this account of the flood, another piece falls into place. And now we can see more biblical themes appear. We read how sacrifice comes into play, and we also see how the blood applies. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it. From human beings, each one for the blood of another, I will require a reckoning for human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind, and you be fruitful and multiply, abound on earth and multiply in it. Again, humanity is tasked with fruitfulness and the blessing of multiplication. We are tasked with using the gift of God's creation to work for God's blessing. And there is something interesting here about the blood. Our Bible tells us that humanity is not supposed to eat blood. Once the sacrificial system is established, we'll see in Leviticus 17:11 that it says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you for making atonement for your lives on the altar, for as life, it is the blood that makes the atonement." And here's where I think modern science can give us insight into biblical principles. God says, before anyone would have ever had any idea that the blood carries our oxygen, the breath that God gives us, the breath that God, that whispers the name Yahweh with every inhale and exhale. Before anyone had scientific knowledge to put that together, our biblical writers tell us that the life of the flesh is in the blood. And then they go further to link that life, that blood, to the concept of atonement, to the concept of what Jesus accomplished with his sacrifice to pay for our sins. All the way back to Noah, We see God assigning value to blood, the life that would run down the cross, atoning for our rebellion with the sacrifice of Eve's descendant, Jesus, who would crush the serpent's head. Do you see how it all connects? Do you see how all of this is in God's plan? Jesus is here in this story all the way back in Genesis. But back to Genesis 9, starting with verse 8. Then God said to Noah and his sons, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." This again is a first. God establishing a covenant with humanity. And now in the business world, right, we establish covenants all the time. We call them contracts. And they're almost without exception between people who are offering things of equal value. Someone who wants to have a home built contracts with the plumber who has the means of making running water a possibility. And when the work is done, one party is happy in their home and the plumber is paid. Their agreement is mutually beneficial. Here, though, God is covenanting with a people who he knows are wholly incapable of holding up their end of the bargain. People who insist on living below their potential. God is contracting with and paying the plumber who he knows will never show up to do the job. So with this covenant, God is setting the foundation for the reality that his son, Eve's descendant, and his son's sacrifice and blood will uphold our end of the bargain because we can't do it. Jesus is the goodness we could never hope to reflect, and he is the one who will take our debt while we enjoy the blessings of the covenant with God. God loves humanity enough not only to make a promise of the blessing that we can't repay, but also to make a way for us to participate through his own pain and the sacrifice of God's Son. All we have to do is accept the gift and allow Jesus to make the way. God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that there is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that's on the earth." That's the rainbow. The light in the sky, that's only visible because of the rain. The reminder that hardship always leads to something else, if only we look up to God. And I think we've read and said the word rainbow so often that we've forgotten the real word here. It's bow. Like a bow from a bow and arrow. When it rains, when there is hardship, after the storm, God's promise of blessing, God's promise to continue to use humanity for the redemption that is still taking place, God's promise that he remembers us is a bow stretched across the sky, arching over between us and the hardship of the storm as the symbol of God's promise. And I don't think that we can dismiss that God's promise in this case comes after the storm, when we're looking up in faith towards God, even though we had to weather the hardship. That's what faith is. It's simply looking past the hurt we experience because we live in a fallen world and determining that we will continue to look to God. That even though things might be difficult, through faith, we will accept God's promise and the payment for our debt and live in the hope and the freedom that we can have when we embrace that this is all for a reason and we have a role to play. I also can't dismiss the thought of the arrow that comes with the bow. And that our God chose a symbol to represent his promise that points a weapon that's aimed right to the heavens. It is, after all, Jesus, God, who will be the sacrifice that Isaiah prophesies hundreds of years before Jesus was born. But he was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Worship team, you can come back up. You see, this is all part of the plan. Even back to prehistory, the promise of redemption runs through this story like a deep river, bringing life to this book and to our struggle. We're here for a purpose. You are here for a purpose. God didn't put you on this earth to just slog through for another day. You have a purpose and you're part of the plan. All you have to do is look up and remember that when God made a promise and used a bow to act as a sign, God knew that that arrow would be pointed right at him. But he loves you enough to have taken the arrow, to have sacrificed on the cross so that you can walk in the beauty of God's covenant and plan, living by the grace of a God who loves us enough not only to make a way for us, but also to see to it, that we get to play a role in the redemption if we only keep our eyes up. So today, I invite you to stand if you can. Today, if things haven't added up for you, and you're struggling to try to figure out where you belong, the answer's simple. God's made a promise to us, one that we can either accept or reject. I, for one, choose to live in God's hope. I choose to accept that I can never be good enough to earn my way, but there was one who was, and that's Jesus. And so he made my way when he hung on the cross. He made my way when he stepped in and paid the price that I couldn't. And because of that, I can step into the promise under that bow and know that I know that God is with me. And when we do this, we become the people that God can work with.